Hello, everyone. Welcome to the 10th Brad lecture in this series on social protection. This one is on public works programs, as you can see. We're very excited to have Professor Arthur Alic-Lagrange and Professor Clement Imbert coming to share with us from their experience at the World Bank and Sciences Po. We would first just like to say, as usual, if you would like to be a live participant, please raise your hand. We'll select about 20 of you. And we ask that you have your cameras on, mics off, and you'll be able to ask live questions at the end during the Q&A. For everyone else, please put your questions into the Q&A box, and we will try to get to as many as we can. We have just 2 lectures after this, so we're closing in on the end of the series, and we're just really grateful for everyone's attendance and are excited to see this through to the beginning of December. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Arthur. Thanks so much, everyone.
Thanks so much for having me. My name is Arthur Alic-Lagrange. I'm a senior economist with the World Bank. I'm specialized on the policy evaluation and their impact on poverty and inequality, covering currently the West African countries. Today, we'll be speaking with Clement about a public works program in poor and middle-income economy. So what are public works programs? PWP moving forward. So they are also called workfare or cash for work programs. They basically provide employment to the poor on a small infrastructure project, like think road rehabilitation, small irrigation networks in a rural community, and so on. In 1915 State of Safety Nets report by the World Bank, 94 countries were counted with public works programs. It's probably more nowadays, even more. They have a long history in South Asia, but also in Europe, in 19th century England, in the US in the 1930s. One very common example that you will see referred to in the literature are the workhouses in Europe and North America. Specifically in England, in the 19th century, workhouses were the main, if not the only option for the poor to receive a public assistance. You will see this well described in Martin Ravallon's book on the economics of poverty, published in 1915. One anecdote on a famous individual, Charlie Chaplin, actually spent part of his childhood in a workhouse. And if you read his autobiography published in 1964, there's a detailed description of the living condition in the workhouses, but also why he ended up in the workhouse with his mother and siblings. And there's this sentence that there was no alternative for his mom. She was burdened with 2 children and in poor health, and so she decided that the 3 of them would enter the workhouse. And that actually relates with the key rational motivation for imposing work requirement in workhouses or outside workhouses in the context of social program is to target people. That is, people who decide to participate. There is a self-targeting motivation for the implementation of this program. And at the same time, when you go through the literature, or if you participate or listen to a policy dialogue around the use of work requirement in social protection programming, you will see that they are described often with many virtues and many perverse effects, depending on proponent or opponent to this type of policy. You will see that they would be described as active labor market policies, that they are described possibly improving skills of participants, that they would work as safety net, improving consumption and savings, adding an insurance aspect to the intervention. There is also an idea that the small infrastructures or the work that is implemented on the program would actually have a predictive value. You would read that they would contribute to female empowerment and so on. So in a way, as you go into the literature on public works, you feel a bit like the blind man touching the elephant in the parable, that touching part of the or one facet of the public works makes you lose the big picture of what are actually public works. So let me give you a few broad description or elements of public works. as we go through the literature review, or as we went through writing this literature review with Clément, we observed that most of the literature concerned two main programs, the one in India and Ethiopia, MNREX, that is more of a rural public works program, and the productive safety net program in Ethiopia, that is mostly rural, has also some urban aspect. You see it listed as the last one here. So most of the evidence come from two programs actually in India and in Ethiopia. So why impose work requirement in a poverty alleviation program? There is a screening argument on the positive end, but there is also a balancing effect, that is the impact of this work requirement on the income gains you can expect from imposing work requirement. The self-targeting intuition is quite clear. So think of a policymaker or social planner choosing between two main forms of social protection. One that is a workfare, where you would impose a work requirement for the beneficiaries, and one that is welfare, that is unconditional cash transfer. The main rationale for going for the workfare option is that you hope to screen the agent. That is, if you have limited information on who is poor and who is not, typically the case in a highly informal economy where there is no administrative information on income, for example. If you impose a work requirement at a low wage rate, you hope that you will screen in only the poor and that the non-poor will opt out and not participate. So your budget outlay on the social protection program will be lower. So typically, Charlie Chaplin and his family, the mom decided to go in the workhouse because there was no other option at a time when in England there was very limited information, administrative information on income. And so she self-targets, she basically revealed her poverty status through the fact that she entered the workhouse. So intuitively, in this decision, two big things will matter. That is the information that the government has on private income, who is poor and who is not, and the difference in productivity. If you use the wage rate as the screening element, that means that you expect the wage rate to vary between the poor and the non-poor. You need a gradient between the wage rate of the poor and the non-poor to be high enough for this screening argument to make sense. At the same time, we need to keep in mind that imposing the work requirement will create foregone earnings. It's no free lunch targeting. That is, Charlie Chaplin's mom coming in the workhouse forgoes some earnings that she would have earned on the private labor market if she would have stayed out of the workhouse. That is, this tax paid by the poor to reveal themselves as being poor to the social planner will need to be compensated for if the objective is to bring an agent to some minimal level of welfare. So beyond the intuition, let's go into some formalization of the work requirement. I avoid putting any equation here. You can go to the literature, specifically the paper by Basley and Coate in 1992, and a follow-up paper in 1995 that will provide you with the math and the equation to the formal argument I'm presenting here. So let's assume that poverty is driven by low productivity. That is, if you're poor, you have a low wage rate compared to non-poor with a high productivity. And let's assume that the government's objective is to bring everyone to the poverty line. Not necessarily the national poverty line, but to a minimum acceptable level of welfare. And then the government decides between a work requirement and an unconditional cash transfer. So then the government's decision will obviously depend on how much the government knows about everyone's, or each and every agent, private income. Under full information, if the social planner has full information on the private sector earnings, then obviously the cost-efficient policy is to not go for work requirement, but do a transfer to each household with what is needed for this household to reach the poverty line with an unconditional targeted cash transfer. The problem will come when there is asymmetric information. That is, when only agent knows their private earnings, in which case imposing a work requirement at a low wage rate might be cost-effective for the social planner. And there are two balancing effects here. There's a positive effect on your budget outlay of the work requirement, is that only part of the population will take up. So there will be fewer beneficiaries receiving the transfer. So the budget outlay goes down as the share of the population that is poor, that will self-select, is low. So the share of the population that is poor is one big parameter in deciding whether or not to impose a work requirement. The negative impact or balancing effect of the work requirement is that participants will lose income from the private sector earnings while they participate. So each beneficiary of the public works will need to receive a larger amount than in the counterfactual unconditional cash transfer. So the cost will be higher per participant. And that will be driven by the ratio of the wage rate of the rich to the poor. If the poor have a very low wage rate on the private sector labor market, then their foregone earnings will be lower. You will have a lower amount to transfer on top of the poverty gap to have the agent make it to the poverty line. So typically in the literature, and that's the core of the 1992 paper by Baisley and Koch, you see these two parameters compared, the ratio of productivity between the poor and the non-poor, and the share of the population that is poor. When the ratio is low, then the work requirement makes less sense. When the share of the population that is poor is low, then the work requirement makes more sense. What do we see in the literature, in the empirical literature, on the targeting power of the public works, of the works requirement? If we look at the case of India and Ethiopia, as I mentioned, the two main programs for which we have empirical evidence, actually they show strong screening power. For the Indian NREGA, if you look at the National Sample Survey from 2009 and 11, I believe that's the round 11, and reports on this data by Dutta, Ravaillant, and other co-authors in 2014. And you see that's on the curve on the right. In the bottom part of the consumption distribution, the participation is about 30%. And as you go all the way up to the top of the consumption distribution, the participation goes to nearly zero. But you see it's not zero, nearly zero. And it's also the case in Ethiopia. Barrett and Clay in 2003 have reported some targeting error, that is inclusion error, some non-poor household finding ways to have some of their members participate in the program. In the specific context studied by Barrett and Clay, because some of the households in the richer part of the distribution have more workers available among their members, so it's easier for them to send one member to a public work site, which explains some of these leakages, if you want. Now, in terms of the impact on the net earnings that is related to this concept of foregone earnings, theoretically, you might expect those foregone earnings to depend on the specific equilibrium or condition of the labor market where the program is being implemented. If you're working, and that's what we report in the table here, on the first row, if you're working for a rural public works program in the lean season or in underemployment context in urban public works, you expect actually, and let's look at the hours worked, you expect participants to work more hours when the program is implemented than in the counterfactual situation where it's not implemented. Why? Because workers will swap some work spent unemployed to time spent working on the program. Very different under full employment situation. If you're in a full employment context, participants will swap time working at a lower wage rate to time working on the scheme at a higher wage rate. Note that in this we assume that there is no income effect. That is, if you do more, if you get at a higher income level, your decision on the number of hours worked is unaffected. On the wage rate, that's the first column, we expect a positive effect, and that's organic. If participants decide to go for the work requirement, that is because the wage rate offered on the work requirement is higher than the wage rate offered on the private sector option, independent of the labor market condition. So in the end, in terms of the total income, when you are in unemployment, underemployment, lean season context, you expect the impact, the impact in terms of net income gains to be way higher in the lean season and underemployment situation, and higher in full employment. In lean season underemployment, you expect this to be very high because of the wage rate effect, but also because of the extra hours worked thanks to the program. And in the full employment context, you expect this to happen mostly through a wage rate effect. What do we see in the literature on this actually is the alignment of the findings with this theoretical expectation. That is, we document, we see in the literature substantial net income gains in rural areas, specifically for India, where the MNREGA is often implemented in the lean season or in context of low alternative employment opportunities. Clément and others have found, for example, earnings 20% higher than the average daily earnings on MNREGA. And I found with Martin Ravalion, using the DNSS and also a specialized survey in Bihar, a sizable increase in the number of days worked thanks to the program. In urban areas, the findings are a bit mixed because you will find situation with underemployment and situation with full employment. For example, in Ethiopia, PSNP, and not PSNS, Franklin and actually Clément and co-authors have found a big premium on the wage rate, so how much people make per day, but no impact on the total number of hours worked by participants. On the other hand, in Côte d'Ivoire, PGDEC, Patrick Trémant and others have found both an impact on earnings and on the total number of hours of work in a context of a program targeting youth unemployment. And typically, for this underemployment segment of the labor market, people would actually work more when the program is offered than in the absence of the program. So the findings are consistent with the theory across. There are extension of this formal model of self-targeting and net income gains. I will mention two aspects. One is when you factor the disutility of the work requirement into the objective function of the policy of the social planner. You see, in context of underemployment, as we said, intuitively, and that's what we see in the empirical literature, people would work more thanks to the program in terms of number of hours. But then if you only focus on the increase in income, you miss the fact that there is some extra disutility imposed by the work requirement. People would not be working as much in the absence of the program. It also depends on the way this disutility is included, is factored in the social planner objective function. It doesn't need to be exactly the disutility parameter as felt by the participants, but if it's included in some ways, it will actually affect the cost efficiency of the work requirement and the decision between work requirement versus unconditional cash transfer. We can also extend the program to the context of income shocks. You see that these programs are often implemented in context of a safety net addressing income shocks, but then this brings the question of the cost efficiency, as we are working under some assumption of the ratio of the wage rate of the poor to the non-poor. If there are shocks affecting this wage rate, it will really matter the magnitude of the shock between the shock affecting the rich and the poor on this cost-effective condition. I stop sharing and I let you share the slide so that we continue with the second part. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur. Are there any pressing questions on that part before we move on? I think for the purpose of making sure the sort of the basis is covered. If there's any question that comes up.
There are a few questions in the chat on this first section. If you want to take a look at those now, you can. If you want to,
I see. I couldn't see them somehow. In the webinar chat.
So
okay,
I'm not seeing them either.
Q&A box.
Oh, it's a Q&A box. Okay, thank you. Sorry.
I see the Q&A box.
Another option is for Arthur to answer these through typing as you lecture, and then we can come back in the Q&A session and
I
answer me live if you wish.
mm,
I do see the question actually on the Q&A. One question is regarding unconditional payment transfer, or only distributing money can alleviate poverty. And another actually related is, should the objective not be to make sure the poor people are employed in regular jobs? In addition to earnings, the other type of opportunity cost, I see the foregone human capital appreciation. That I think relate to some things that Clément will present next. That is, what are the positive impact going beyond beyond the net gains, the direct net gains during the implementation of the program for the participants specifically.
yeah.
So I think this is something that Clément will answer as in the second part.
Yeah.
Um,
I think quite a few questions are
Yeah.
about the change demand for labor affecting labor markets. Those are things I will cover now. Same for hunger, actually. We'll talk about this. Perhaps maybe one question, which is the question on inference. How are you able to tease out causal effect in the public work context when we already know that the sample of participating individuals is self-selected? I think that's perhaps a good general question we could address in terms of methodology. You want to take that? Yeah.
I'm happy to say a word about this, and that's a very important question. When you look at the literature, a lot is non-experimental, and one reason why is that it's extremely difficult to randomize participation in a work requirement. People self-select in the work requirement for reasons that are very often not observed and endogenous to many aspects of the economic life of these households. The way it's done in the literature, there are different approaches where you look, for example, in India at the fact that the program was rolled out not everywhere at the same time. So there are lags in implementation between places, districts. What was done, and that's the paper referred to by Martin Ravalian and others in Bihar, is to actually ask direct question to participants. What would you be doing if you would not be participating in this work? How many days would have worked otherwise? What would have been the wage rate received during these days? But that's definitely a point salient in the literature. Is the identification strategies are often non-experimental, rely on more complex identification strategies. Yeah, thank you.
And maybe quickly, I'll come back to the women empowerment part. But quickly, there's a question on gender, and you see often women participating into a public works program, and that could be by design because those programs are trying to encourage women directly to participate. But just from what Arthur just presented, you see that in many contexts, the opportunity cost of time or for women might be lower, either because they have more restricted access to labor markets, or they might have a lower level of human capital, or face discrimination if they do work on the labor market. So that means that typically the public works program wages would be more attractive, everything else equal, to women than to men. Which is also a reason why, even in contexts where men tend to work much more for wages than women, actually in public works program you see a much higher participation of women in relative terms. Okay, thank you for your questions, and I think quite a few are going to be addressed by what I'll talk about now. So let me just share my screen, and okay, so hopefully you can see my screen. So let me now move on to the impact of public works program beyond the direct income gains. And I think as the as the introduction made clear, I'll be talking about, all the other parts of the elephant. And I think, I guess our effort in this course and in the review paper we wrote was to try and cover all of those aspects, but without sort of losing the general picture, as in often it will be the case, and I'll try and highlight them as we go, that those different objectives are actually sometimes in contradiction with each other. That is, like, you cannot achieve those objectives together because one parameter of the program, for example, the wage rate or the availability, the type of work that is being organized, might directly serve one purpose, but also reduce its effectiveness in other ways. And I'll highlight those as we go. So let me start with the effects on labor markets, which is, I guess, has been raised in one question and is very important part of my own research. One can really think of the work program as a labor market intervention by governments, and in the context of developing countries, especially in rural areas, rural labor markets are basically unregulated, and this is a context where governments have very little intervention. So it is sometimes, you think of public works program as the first and the only ways in which governments are trying to influence labor. And I should highlight that the effects of public works program on labor markets will crucially depend on the wage that they offer and also on the labor market equilibrium. And what's a bit difficult is you would expect governments to know what the labor market is or what the labor market is like, and then as accordingly choose the design of the public works program. But actually, for the same reason that the government doesn't actually intervene in those labor markets, or is not regularly present, we also have very little data, and we don't actually often know how those labor markets function. So the basic and premise of a public works program, or the usual premise of introducing public works program, as Arthur highlighted, is that there is some surplus labor. That there's so it could be an economy characterized permanently by surplus labor, by the fact that there's just not enough productive work to go around. So people's wages, people's employment opportunities are very the productivity when they work is very low. It could also, and that's also often the case of public works program. Public works programs would be implemented in economic downturns. So in a rural setting, it might be a drought. In a more industrial setting, it could be, a financial crisis, like in Argentina in 2001. So you have the idea that public works programs are coming in when there's a lot of people who are either unemployed, strictly speaking, or underemployed. Think of, low productivity work on the family farm. And so the public works programs, in their usual design, offer below market wages, and they attract those people who are underemployed. Now, in practice, or in many contexts that I've studied, public works program wages are often set above market wages, and that could be due to different reasons. But I think the simplest to explain is that the government cannot, for example, undercut the minimum wage, the legally fixed minimum wage. So no private employers complies with the minimum wage, say in a rural labor market, but the government has to abide by it, which means that the public works wage that will be offered will usually be much higher than the market wage, which means that if public works programs are implemented in labor markets that are actually more competitive or tighter or than one would think a priori, then the public works program could still attract workers in this setting because the public works wages are just much higher than what anyone could get. So by anyone here, I need to be very careful. I'm just talking about the labor markets that the poor are engaged in. So we don't usually think, and that's part of the targeting that Arthur showed, that high educated workers would work on the public works. And so the public works wages would not be higher than educated workers' wages or, government, say, employees. We're talking here about, casual market, casual labor wages, the type of work that unskilled laborers would do. Labor markets could also be non-competitive in different ways. And so you could have market power on the employer side, that's usually called a monopsony, or you could think about sort of a mix of market power on the employer and sometimes the worker side with social norms that prevents employers to decrease wages, for example, in times of droughts, or definitely decrease them in nominal terms when there's low inflation. And there's a lot of evidence that this is the case, for example, with superimposed work. So this is a summary table of what we expect the labor market effects of public works programs to be, depending on the equilibrium on the labor market. So if we're in a surplus labor economy with a slack labor market, think of it perhaps as lean season in an agricultural context, you might expect public works programs to increase total employment. The government is providing employment. People otherwise would not be working or be working fewer hours, and now total employment is increased. By definition of surplus labor, that's the way Amartya Sen defined it in the 1960s. In surplus labor, you can take away some workers that would have been working for other employers, but most often for the family farms, for example. You can take away some workers with no effect on general productivity or on private sector wages. So that's the case that often public works programs are thought, or like that's the sort of framework that most policymakers have in mind while implementing a public works program. In two cases that I have studied, and of course I'll come back to this. So both the case of India and the case of the urban public works program in Ethiopia, I have seen that public works programs actually have positive effect on wages. And this can be interpreted in different ways. And so I've put there three cases. The simplest one from an economic point of view, because that's the framework that most economists, the basic framework that most economists have, not necessarily working in developing countries, is a competitive labor market. So if the labor market is tight, what happens? Well, the public works program is displacing private sector work. So people do public works, work on the public works, rather than working on doing something else in the private sector. And that puts pressure on private sector wages. Okay, so you have employers that now need to pay higher wages to attract workers because part of the labor force has been employed by the government, by the state, through those public works programs. Now, this is not the only setting in which you might have an increase in wages from a public works programs. Either if you have an employer market power or socially accepted wage, the public works program can come in and offer a reference for collective bargaining of maybe not in a formal sort, but in village labor market, you see that happening, where public works program would actually increase wages with not necessarily negative effects on employment. One example would be if you have employer market power, where employers are sort of decreasing both or depressing both wages, as in employer market power is depressing both wages and employment. Well, public works program, by introducing some contestability, some competition on the demand side of the labor market, could both increase wages and employment. So as you see, that's the sort of theoretical landscape. You could really have one effect and the other both on wages and employment. So then the question is, what does the evidence say? So as I said, and I alluded to this already, the MG and RGS, when we studied it with John Papp, did seem to have positive effect on wages. So here we've been looking at all India effects. We've been using quasi-experimental variation, that is, we've been using the rollout of the program across districts, difference in different sort of setting. And we find positive effects on wages. We actually also find a decrease in employment, in private sector employment, but mostly in a combination of self-employment and wage employment. So we interpret our effects in a competitive framework. Now, there's, I would say, better evidence that has come across, because it's a large-scale randomized experiment by Muralidharan et al. In 2023. It is, however, only in one state of Andhra Pradesh, which might differ from the rest of India. And they find positive wage effects and also positive employment effects. And they interpret this in a monopsony sort of framework, with the idea that there might be a labor market power on the employer side, and that the workfare program might be increasing both wages and employment. Now, what about other settings? Well, we have less evidence as of India. We have some evidence for rural public works program in Malawi that does increase employment, but it has no effect on wages, as you might expect from a more slack labor market. When we studied the urban public works program in Ethiopia, in Addis Abeba, so that's Franklin 2024, we found no effect on employment. So every day worked on the public works program was 1 day less worked, either self-employed, but mostly for private employers, and an increase in wages. So as you'd expect from a tighter labor market. So I should say, this once you open the box, or once you try and thinking about those public works programs having effect on the equilibrium labor market, you can't just remain strictly local. I think, village economies are never village economies. Villages are integrated, so even a rural program really would have interlinked labor market. Of course, if you're in an urban program, there's no reason to think that that people from one neighborhood would only work in one neighborhood, and of course, neighborhoods across the city would be interlinked. So you have commuting, you have migration, and so there's now really a lot of evidence looking at sort of zooming out progressively, that the MEG and RGS would have increased wages in villages close to villages where MG and RGS expanded in the Muralidharan et al. Experiment in Andhra, that district neighboring program districts, that's Medal 2019, would have also seen increased wages. And then I have some work on seasonal migration, thinking that MG and RGS, by reducing seasonal migration out of very poor districts, would actually put up pressure in sometimes the other side of India, but definitely in urban areas, and you would still find many employers complaining about the program as increasing, putting up pressure on wages, even though they're really far from where the public works program is acting. We find similar evidence at the scale of a city of Addis Abeba in the UPSNP, and we show that program neighborhoods send less commuters, and that has wage effects in neighborhoods that don't have the program themselves. Some of them have the program, but that are exposed indirectly to the program by changes in the commuting flows. Of course, that's a bit more tricky to show, but if you have good information on both migration or commuting, you can have a sense of how the effects of public works propagate. Now, once you have integrated the fact that public works program can increase wages on the labor market, so private sector wages, now you need to rethink, because if you have wage effects, then wage effects is not only for participants, it's for everyone, for all the workers that are in the same labor markets as public work participants. So, if you want to compare, and that was the Besley Code framework that author described, you want to think about public works program versus cash in the context of, are these work requirements, do they get you better targeting? But here we're talking about the fact that through the labor market effect, work requirements actually change in the labor market equilibrium and increase wages for all workers. And these indirect wage effects are a substantial part of the gains for the participants themselves and for people like them. And that's 1/3 for MG and RGS in my paper, my 2015 paper, is 2/3 of the gains in the UPSNP. That's Franklin et al. 2024. And in that case, because of this indirect effect, poverty reduction from public works program might be comparable to cash. Now, not to say that it necessarily becomes better, but for example, in the context of MG and RGS in Bihar, Morga, I'll say that it would do worse than cash. But in UPSNP in Ethiopia, we'd say that actually it does better than cash. And here, remember, this is a combination of direct effects, so to the participants. And again, and that's what Arthur explained, if you have relatively high wages on the program, and it attracts people who have actually pretty good opportunities of work in the private sector, that means that the direct benefits might be smaller, right? Because people are working on those programs, they're making quite a bit of money, but they would have made money otherwise. And so the difference is not that big. However, those effects through the labor market equilibrium might be very large, okay? And it's a bit like the tail that moves the dog in the sense, because you might have 10% or 15% of people working on those public works programs that have effects on wages for all the workers. Now, high wages is good news for workers. I'm not going to say that everyone's going to be happy with it because someone needs to pay them. Okay, so you need to think about it in the context of redistribution. So you have, in the case of Muralidharan et al., 2023, in the Andhra Pradesh paper, they would say the top of the landholding distribution suffers, right? So those that depend on those workers that now need to be paid more, obviously might complain. And so it's an interesting case where those labor market effects actually involve or imply a second round of redistribution. So the first round of redistribution is you raise taxes to pay people to work. The second round on the public works, the second round of the redistribution is now this has an increase and this pushes up wages on the private sector. And so now employers need to pay more. So this has effects. This has negative economic effects, but in terms of poverty reduction, this might be beneficial. Okay, so now coming to other aspects, one that came up in the Q&A already, which is, how should we think of public works program as a way to improve long-term labor market prospects by building worker skills, building experience? And here, unfortunately, the news is not very good. Okay, so the meta-analysis from Baga et al. Finds positive short-term effects. That is, maybe in the short run, people are more employed, but that's what you'd expect because they are on the public works. But in the long run, you have small and insignificant effects. And that actually, and we sort of mentioned it briefly in the paper, but that really resonates with the big, the Clouvet et al. Big meta-analysis of active labor market policies in developed countries that say that providing employment, so government employment, is not generally doesn't have those very large positive effects in the long run, in terms of making people, once they get off the program, put them on an upward trajectory in the private sector. And the recent example of the PECHDEC in Côte d'Ivoire really suggests that there's basically no effect 12 months after. And so here again, just coming back to this idea that you have contradictory objectives. So, on the one hand, you want to have income support, you want to make sure that, all the poor who want have, right there access to some employment locally, etc. So if you want to ensure that, it's going to be hard to give meaningful employment, to give training, to give something that will then, where people will learn skills that will be very valuable later for their career. So employment generation, I would say in most cases, would take priority over training. Okay. Not to say that you can't add it. And in fact, for example, the UPSNP in Ethiopia tried to add a training module on top of the public works program. But of course, it becomes a different program. Now, what are the benefits? What happens to the income that people earn from the public works programs? And so in very poor settings, you do find that it gets people out of hunger, and you see increase in food consumption. In most contexts, and that's here I'm thinking of the going back to this lit review by Baguette. In most contexts, you have small or null effects on food consumption, and most effects on durable consumption. And that's just the way it is. Like you have poor households, but are not literally starving. They are using this extra income to buy other stuff that they do need. In some contexts, and especially in urban settings, actually, you find even positive effects on savings. That is, this extra income is actually saved. And so there, it's almost a Friedman sort of permanent income setting where you're thinking of people who are not necessarily credit constraints and are actually, because they have a windfall income, actually save the additional money in order, to cover expenses later. Rather than consume right away. So again, how are the income gains of public works programs used? That really depends on the basic level, the level of poverty in the context, and how credit constraints the beneficiaries are. We also find, I should say, not only increase in savings, but also decrease in debts, so that people repay other debts, etc., other credits. Now, an interesting part of the public works literature, their evaluation, is the one that thinks about the insurance aspect. And of course, it's quite prevalent, especially if you're thinking about the temporary public works programs that are put in times of crisis, such as the Argentina program. But also, you've seen long-run programs that can be expanded when needed. For example, the MGNR was expanded in COVID, so the work allocation was increased. The PSNP also has those features in times of drought. So indeed, you would expect this public works program to reduce food insecurity, to reduce borrowing, and that's where you see that it's by providing free insurance, those public works programs also reduce the need for other more costly types of coping strategies that poor households put in place. Another case in point would be temporary migration, which might be monetarily a bit costly, but also very costly non-monetarily. You need to, go and spend 3 months sleeping on the pavement and working in horrible condition on work sites in big cities in India, for example. Well, you don't need to do that if you have Narega work. Sorry, I skipped this. And another side of this is that as people are covered, like they're in case of income shocks, they can also take more risks. And there is evidence that both the PSNP in rural Ethiopia and MGNRGS actually increase risk-taking among farmers, technology adoption in terms of in the case of Gideon et al., and increase risky crop choice in the case of Gerker 2019. But I would say more work is needed on that. And then another aspect would be, what about the value of work? So the infrastructure, this small infrastructure that public works program organize, how, is it valuable? Again, there's a bit of a trade-off. There's a bit of a tension between the different objectives of the program. You want local employment provision, so you can't be building highways. Highways need a lot of machines and not a lot of labor. So you need to have some things, projects that are labor intensive, small, and local. So you have a list for MGNRGS allowed works, and that's small rural roads, again mostly dust roads, not a lot of paved roads, water harvesting, tree planting. In the urban UPSNP program in Addis Ababa, that'd be street cleaning, drain maintenance, flower beds planting, etc. So because they are small and labor intensive, the general assumption in the literature is that the value of the works is low, but we really don't have much evidence. Most of the evidence is a bit negative in the sense that the literature on the rural PSNP in Ethiopia finds little effect on agricultural productivity. MGN just works in functional, in many contexts, useful, but we don't really know how much they contributed, say, to agricultural productivity. In the case of the UPSNP, we can show that people are happier with their neighborhoods. Now, how much do you value that? How do you put a price tag on that? That's a bit harder. So what about female empowerment? So jumping to really another context. As I explained earlier, public works programs, because they offer the same employment opportunities to men and women, they tend to be relatively more attractive to women. In addition, many public works programs actually are proactive, have the MGNRGS as quotas for women, offer childcare facilities. So you would expect public works program to improve women's employment and financial situation, but we really don't have a lot of evidence there. There's Burkina Faso. There's one work in Burkina Faso by Ajayi et al. There's also some work on attitudes and norms, and both from Central African Republic and India's MGNRGS, again, with some evidence that public works program can really change male and female attitudes towards household work on the one hand, and towards outside work on the other hand. But here is really one aspect where more evidence will be needed. So what about children? So when parents participate to the public works program, especially the mothers, this can have an ambiguous effect on children. And here I would say the jury is basically split. I can give you two papers, Shah and Millet-Stenberg, Lee and Sekri, that say that MGNRGS decreased school enrollment and increased child labor because mothers went to work. And then I can give you two papers, Afridi et al. 2016 and Mani et al. 2020, that basically say the opposite. I'm a bit disingenuous here. It's not exactly on the same, they don't look exactly at the same age range. But the second group of papers would say that it increased schooling by increasing mothers' income and strengthening their bargaining power in the household. So again, one aspect on which we need more. Now I'll go perhaps more quickly through other aspects of public works program. For better or for worse, public works programs have been an interesting study ground for corruption because they provide opportunities for corruption, but also they provide the opportunities to innovate on anti-corruption policies. And there's quite a large literature on this in the case of MGNRGS. In India, the public works program, you can think of public works program as empowering local officials. So it's done a lot. Definitely in the case of India, it's been documented, but I think in Ethiopian context as well, it's done a lot to strengthen the local administration. So think about it, public works programs are complicated. You need registration, organize the work, monitor it, pay. And so you might think about it as empowering local officials. We have one ongoing project where we show that awareness about the local responsibility of local leaders in implementing the MGNRGS actually increases local political competition. Now you have competition. I could go the other way, of course. Strong local authorities could capture public works programs. They could, give give work to their cronies. They could block the public works programs altogether if they can't use it. And governments in general, can use and claim credit from public works programs to gain votes. I guess that's the political game. Finally, and I think quite importantly in many settings, public works programs are often implemented in conflict zones or in post-conflict zones with the idea that they can help people cope with consequences of conflict or dissuade them to join the conflict themselves. And I think the evidence goes more in the favor of the fact that public works program could reduce conflict. Although here again, on Amgen and RGS, again, the sort of evidence base or the evidence is a bit split, with some evidence that it did reduce Maoist conflicts, and some evidence that it might not have the desired effect, but only in places where it had no effect on wages and employment. So I would say overall, it seems that as and when income gains from public works programs are materializing, they do seem to reduce conflict. There's mixed evidence on the violence and crime among participants themselves, with, I think, some work by Arthur in Central African Republic, showing that it increased security, but not necessarily social cohesion. And in Papua New Guinea, the work by Ivashenko et al., showing that it might have no effect on crime. So here, I think that's really another place where we need more evidence. So to conclude, I'll just mention a few takeaways and where the knowledge gaps are. So main takeaways, I think, is that the work requirements in themselves are neither good or bad. They need to, be put in place in settings where they make sense. So they will make sense in the direction that Arthur first indicated, which is, in places where you might have a large difference in wage rates between the poor and the non-poor, and you might not have too many people that are poor in the population when you really want to target them. As I explained, labor market conditions will matter for the cost efficiency of public works program. If you enter a situation where there's a lot of surplus labor, you can hope that the participants will work more thanks to the program. If you enter a labor market that is much tighter, they might reduce their hours worked in the private sector. You might have second round effects on wages, and you might want that as a government, but that's something to keep in mind. And obviously you need to have all of this in mind before you choose, how you set the program wage rate, and how you decide how many days you're actually offering. And then, in terms of the main takeaways of impact beyond direct gains, I would say that, in some settings, it seems like public works programs would increase wages for non-participants, would have little effects on skills and employability. They might increase consumption for poorer households and savings for richer households. They do provide insurance and encourage productive investments. They seem to have ambiguous effects on child labor and education. And they generally reduce conflicts. They might, give opportunities for corruption and can be captured locally. But I think I would say the same of more social programs. And in terms of where we think, we need more evidence, I think so. Arthur has some work on that, but the psychological cost of the work versus gains from participation. So you hear that sometimes, there's self-worth, and so you have psychological gains from working, for example, in refugee camps. I think the effects on female empowerment should really be studied a lot more. The effects on children education, as I highlighted, is ambiguous yet. And this idea of whether public works infrastructure are valuable or not needs to be investigated. I think what's interesting also, and what should motivate people to evaluate public works programs, is that you can learn about public works programs, but you can also learn about more broadly about the value of people's time, the labor market equilibrium, and you can think about it not only for the average worker, but worker by age, by caste, etc., and by gender. And I think I'll stop here. I'm out of time. Thank you. So how do we want to do this? Should we answer questions in the Q&A or?
If I can suggest we ask first the live panelists, if anyone
Yeah.
has a question that they would like to ask, and once we've done a few of those, we can shift to the Q&A.
Yep.
Panelists, if you do have a question, please raise your hand and we'll just go in the order that you ask. In that case, I say that we, if you guys would like to just scan the Q&A, you've both had a look now, and if there's any that you'd like to hit first, we can do that.
I think there's a hand raised by Geoffrey.
Joffrey, okay, do you want to kick us off?
Right. Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity. And I want to thank you for the contribution you have made and for such an interesting area. My question goes mainly to the Public Works Department, but the case of many developing countries where you find that the Public Works Department is broken and underfunded. And so you find that there is very little activity going on in terms of professional development of workers, but also very little in welfare. In fact, such governments do not pursue welfare programs. Now, most of the housing that happens for staff are old and dilapidated, and many are being converted into office space. I am wondering how you can bring advocacy to show that well-kept workers, well-trained workers are more effective, and how you can get back to fund these priorities. So that I would wish to have that question. Then the second one would be, after these 12 weeks, is it possible for somebody to get onto a research program and then have it supervised, and finally the person is able to get a full PhD by London School? Or yeah, otherwise, thank you very much. I'll end it there.
So I won't answer on the PhD side. Maybe that's more. I'm not at the London School of Economics, but I would say on your points, which I think is really were many points at once. I think you were raising the fact that that the public works administration will often lacked resources, and I think it's very important to recognize the costs of public works programs in terms of organizational capacity, etc. And that can't be counted for nothing. In some ways, I spin it in a positive way. I said, it develops local administrative capacity, but you could see it in a negative way, which is, in many contexts, that capacity just isn't there or cannot be developed. And for that reason, those programs are, it might be a better idea not to do those programs. And so I would agree that the preconditions of that need to be met, or some resources need to be spent. And I guess you could think about the fact that Ethiopia, and the fact that Ethiopia and India come again and again in this discussion, and they have long-running program. They might have more state capacity invested in those programs than most other countries. So I would agree with you. And maybe on the skill part, I would say my impression is that if you want to do a training program, you should do a training program, and that public works program, serve a different purpose. And that would be my view. Maybe Arthur.
Thank you so much, Clément. I don't have much to add. I mean, there are questions in the chat and that relate to this operational aspect of the public works, on whether there are some public works plus like variation of this work requirement that would address some of the negative effect. I think it's generally rule that the public works will have some code of conduct or some form of protocol on the way work is implemented. You could have add-on also in some places on childcare offered at the work sites for some female participants to bring their kids. I think this is the case in the implementation of MNREGA in India. There is some evidence on the impact of this childcare provision in Burkina Faso. I do believe also that the implied administrative reach through this expansion of public works program or the rollout of public works program has an impact, a second round impact on the development of the national safety net programs. If you look at the emergency cash transfer during COVID, the fact that there was some registry of workers in place in India, I think made India in a better place than other places. If you look at Nigeria, there is a question on Nigeria in the list. When COVID hit, the lack of the coverage of the administrative registry of poor and vulnerable families was not as developed as in India. And I think the fact that MNREGA was active for many years before COVID put India in a good place for this emergency cash transfer. And that's also one of the questions, like in case of big covariate shocks like COVID, like a flood, or should we switch to cash transfer? Probably, but the infrastructure in place of the payment systems, the registry of beneficiaries can be extremely useful to switch to an emergency cash transfer. Thank you.
I'll just weigh in briefly on your second question. Right now, there is not, unfortunately, a way to extend these courses to a formal qualification through the London School of Economics. This course offers a certification of attendance from IGC and from BRED. And that's been a positive thing for the courses in the past, and we'll do that in the future. But that's unfortunately what we're limited to right now. But I would love one day maybe wider and deeper integration with LOC.
I think there are more questions from the panel. Darshana, do you want to speak?
Yes, thank you. So I'm from India, and I'm thinking of the public works program in India from a gendered social policy point of view. So when I look at MGNREGA, especially in a developing nation like India, we tend to understand it from a financial point of view mostly. But since COVID, I think the need for us to move away from the financial discourse is important. So, how do we really bridge the gap between empowerment of rural women and public works program in a developing nation? How do we move past this financial discourse? How do we create social capital? How do we create empowerment? How do we empower women politically through public works program? Because in my state in India, it is quite visible in the rural level. Women
Which is
who
your state, if I might ask?
Kerala. So here, women who participate in MGNREGA programs tend to be more politically active. They take up more decision-making positions. So, how do we, when we see it from a national point of view, how do we move past this financial discourse? Thank you.
Yes, that's a very interesting point. I've done most of my fieldwork on MGNREGA in Rajasthan and Bihar, and I think in Rajasthan it's definitely the case, but I feel like, and you say you're coming from Kerala, so I feel like there's basically some cases where the public works program sort of meets a civil society that's ripe in the sense of empowerment, organization, self-organization, if I think of Rajasthan and all these local the NGOs, these sort of work organizations, and that really like MKSS and etc. So that Emergency and RGS really sort of met that, and there's some case of that in Bihar, although perhaps I feel like the female involvement was higher in the way I've experienced it in Rajasthan. So I feel that there's definitely a way. I see this as a co-construction. So it's not the case that the government per se doesn't necessarily have the means to create that engagement or to, but I feel that it can definitely contribute to it. And the way I've seen it built up is in the case of Bihar, for example, with the role of GVK and the self-help groups, okay, which is, I guess, mostly focused on microfinance and not direct, doesn't necessarily have to do with the public works program, which is less developed in Bihar. But it is what you're saying, which is, you have groups of women, you have, powerful women that emerge, and then that end up taking larger political roles. I guess what I fail to see is any sort of broad, I can't make any sweeping statement, or like it's hard to think of it as in terms of guidelines, because I can cite examples where this happened, but yeah, and in terms of policy recommendations, I don't know where that leaves us. But I think I agree with you. That not only the financial aspect, but also the political aspect is very important for empowerment.
Thank you.
One aspect I could add to this, and that's quite salient in Sub-Saharan Africa, I would say, in this discussion on inclusive growth, like how do we make growth reach the lower part of the distribution, and actually how do we get poverty to reduce to the extent that the economic growth is coming. The fiscal discussion is a big one, and I think the type of reality you raise it's very important and should be highlighted more. That is, there are productive impact of public works, but cash transfer, generally speaking. So it's not a dead cost in the equation, but they take sometimes time to realize, or they are not sometimes explicitly shown. And so I do see your point, but I also see that it's not opposed. It's not that you lose net fiscal space when you do this cash transfer, because you gain economic growth through this. These women participating, this might be economic gender gap being closed. They might enter some economic sector or take up some job after their participation. And these are GDP growth points that come in the equation and possibly make the growth more inclusive. I think that's a very important point. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Maybe Habib, if you wanted to ask a question. Sorry, Habib, if you hear me, can you unmute yourself and ask your question? Oh,
thank you.
Hi.
Thank you, Clement, and thank you, the organizers for this program. I actually enjoy it. Mine is not actually a question, but it is. I really want to look at it in terms of some of the benefits. And in Ghana, we call it. I'm from Ghana anyway. My name is Habib. I was one of the for the Ghana Social Opportunity Project. Under the one they ran was in 2002 up to 2005. That was the phase one, and then they went to the phase two. We call it the Ghana Safety Productivity Nets. It was actually meant to. It was a poverty elevation program meant to empower the poor and to provide income for the poor within the northern Ghana, particularly those who are living below $1. And I was part of the project, who managed the program, and it was very good. And I was just liking actually what the Clement and then the other facilitator is talking about, which was very good. Actually, the project went a long way to empower women who are even living below the poverty line. But my question to you has to do with the impact on savings, and then the impact on consumptions, and then the impact on low insurance. Particularly if you look at the program. Our
Habib, your voice been breaking.
I think
Um,
I lost
Do you want to
connection.
try with that video?
Looking at
I think would we be able to I think the part of the question was about the impact on consumption, on savings, and on one other element.
Yes, but what was the question? I didn't get.
I'm not sure. I think we'll need to move on. Habib,
Okay.
if you're able to write in the chat, I can relay the message. Looks like he's
Okay.
them. If are there any questions in the Q&A you guys would like to touch on, or should I just pick a few?
Yeah, up to you.
I can make a point on this insurance mechanism as you look for another question, Caleb, is, and I very briefly mentioned this in the first part of the presentation, but you see in discussing or in evaluating whether you put a work requirement or not, you often anchor the discussion on the income distribution. But then you go and implement the program in context of shocks. And so I think that is a very important point. Are we talking about transient income? Are we talking about permanent income distribution? And where are the shocks affecting the distribution? Are the shocks making the distribution very flat? And then you risk seeing your targeting performance going way down, and you're probably better off going for a cash transfer anyway. Or are the shocks making it wider, and then you're actually gaining further from the work requirements? So this is what I highlighted very briefly. And I think the literature on this is quite scant. Like there are some papers on the insurance impact of these programs, whether consumption goes down or not, and so on. There are papers on the targeting performance and contrasting the cost of cash transfer versus cash for work, but not looking at whether these two policy objectives are competing and the way they actually compete in implementation in some places. The thing of the Sahel is a major public works program implemented in various countries of the Sahel. That's I think is a very relevant question in the literature. Thank you.
Great. There's a few questions in the chat about the human capital effects. Potso asks if, since there's a recent push for adaptive social protection, if there's evidence of the skill enhancement building effects of PWP, and other people were surprised later on to learn that training was not as impactful as they expected, given that human capital is one of the main drivers of economic growth. So do you want to touch on either of those points?
I guess it's coming back to some things I've said, in the sense that that per se, a lot of the work on the public works is not necessarily one that develops skills and human capital. And that's often because governments are trying to provide, work to whoever comes whenever they want to work, and that means that it's not organized in the same way as an apprenticeship or like a training on the job would be. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't have add a training component to public works program. It's actually been done in the UPNSNP, the Ethiopian program, in the program in urban Ethiopia. It's not the part that we evaluated, but it's being tried. So there are ways to do it. I just don't know, to what extent. I mean, I would just say that the public works part, stricto sensu, doesn't seem to be building skills. That's what I could say.
Thank you, Clément. Caleb, I think there was a related question on the potential decay of skills while participating. That is, you get some participants with actually some skills for upper skill labor, and you get them to work on unskilled activities. Is there a decay? I think there are some attempt to look at the India case, see whether it's happening. I don't think it's. I mean, intuitively, you're not going for high skill labor. So you typically get low skill daily casual workers to take up. And then you have the coping strategy channel, but that I think relate to any social protection program. That is, you put beneficiary in a place where they don't need to take negative coping strategy that will have second round negative effect on their human capital, take the kids out of school or affect food security and so on. But that, I think, as you just said, Clément, is not specifically to a work requirement program. That is the potential benefits of social protection in such context. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thanks both. I think let's hear from Ushma, if I can recommend, and then I saw Habib has joined back. And then Habib, after Sushma, if you would keep your video off and just try to keep your question concise, then maybe we can get it before you cut out.
Should I go ahead, Caleb? Yeah, thanks.
Hi.
Okay. I think in one of your slides I saw about this political thing, like connecting it with politics and all that thing. But my question is a follow-up with Darshana had asked regarding that social capital and gendered aspect. A lot of this public works program in India, I can say, as I'm from India, I'm from Bengal. So a lot of the accessibility to this kind of public works programs are mostly one of the huge determinants is clientelism, right? So even Darshana had pointed out that the most of the females who were actually actively participating in this kind of public works program were some way or the other affiliated with some political parties in their local way. So, and most of the time when I go out in the field and speak with some of these people who have availed any, public works program awareness and all that thing, most of their remarks or comments were that we hardly get to know anything because since we are not from any associated with any political party, so we hardly get any access to this all that thing. So have your does this book also essentially looks at the this clientism aspect or not?
Yes, sorry, thank you for raising this because I went quickly through it. Yes, because local officials are in charge of registering beneficiaries and providing work, as you know, and as you know, so it's been documented in Ethiopia, it's been documented in India. You end up with a clientelistic structure where the people who are participating in those programs are poor, as Arthur said, but they would be the poor that local officials want to help and not necessarily others. So you could think then that would be another aspect of the comparison between public works program and cash transfers. If you were to think that cash transfers would be not affected by those clientelistic structures, but to do cash transfers, you again need to be registering people who are poor or not poor, screen them, and the same clientelism might occur. So I would say this clientelism and this favoritism is there in public works program. I don't know to what extent it's specific to those programs. That's a sort of an I would think about this as an open question. But yes, sometimes local politics are such that, as I described, you'd have the poor of a village, of one part of the village that would get the program. The poor of the other part of the village would not get it because it's not in, there's no political interest in things. Yeah.
One idea on this, Clément, I don't know that that has been researched yet. But I think it's interesting also that in some places, that's probably the case in part of rural India, this clientelism also relate to the equilibrium of the labor market. That is, those who suffer an increase of the wage rate on casual manual work, say the big farmers in the community, would actually collude with the authority in this community who is in charge of opening or not a work site. At least theoretically, it would be interesting to decipher the set of incentives. I'm not sure that empirically that can be identified, and whether that's actually something we could see moving in the household survey data.
Mm-hmm. There's a few questions on the health part, and I think that's something we did not address, and it's mostly because the literature doesn't talk a lot about it, but I think it's a very interesting aspect, also because it's public works programs are hard work, manual labor, so the health effects on the negative health effects are not negligible, and of course we would expect positive health effect because people are richer, but this hasn't. So there's no paper that comes to mind. I'm sure it has been studied, but it was not very prominent in the literature as we reviewed it. So I think more work is needed.
Thanks. Habib, do you want to try to unmute and ask your question again? We just have 1 minute left, so just keep it to a few words if you can. That's okay.
Okay. So yeah, and maybe there were some questions on the complementing cash transfers and public works programs and how the two interact. I think it's an interesting question. One question was, when we compare public works program and cash, do we assume the same level of targeting? And indeed, in a lot of the computations I did, I was assuming comparing the cash given to public works program participants versus work. And as the consistency with what Arthur was saying, which is actually if you just have cash, you don't know how to target people. So you could think of a situation where you sort of use the public works program as an initial targeting device, but then you add on cash on that. And that, that's another possibility.
And on this point, Clément, I want to highlight, I've seen examples. I will not mention the specific countries because this is not often, but you see that again and again, of compounding targeting strategies. That is, for example, the proximity test, and that was covered in earlier lectures, where you collect some information and try to proxy the poverty level. That would be administered to applicants to a public works intervention. That's highly problematic. The proximity test formula are usually fitted on a nationally representative survey. And those who participate in the public works, this sample is very specific. And you actually know very little about them because the reason why you do a work requirement is so that they reveal themselves to be poor. So if you would know the characteristic, you would go for PMT only. Compounding the two strategy might lead to a higher exclusion rate or inclusion rate in the targeting process. That's a good occasion to highlight because I see that very often the case with that we intuitively add layers of targeting. It's not the case when you do a square targeting that is better than a single targeting. That's something to highlight in this context. Thank you.
Thanks, Arthur, and thanks, Clement. This has been a wonderful discussion, and thank you to all the participants for your questions. There's a couple dozen more that we couldn't get to, but I hope that as you go back, the slides will be made available, and there's also the reading list that you can learn more from and engage with deeper. So big thanks again to our lecturers today. We will be back next week for our penultimate lecture in the series. on spillovers and general equilibrium effects with Ted Miguel. So we look forward to seeing you then.
Thank you. Bye.